Howdy, partners. Welcome to Saddle and Sixskin. If you're like me, somewhere between 30 and 75 years young, and appreciate a good Western story, then you've come to the right place. We're gonna dive into a tale of the Old West, a story filled with hardship, unexpected love, and a whole lot of grit. So, settle in, grab your coffee, and let's get started. And if you find yourself enjoying this, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe, will ya? We aim to bring you the best stories the West has to offer. Her father, in a moment of what he considered humor, sent her instead of her sister. A cruel jest, plain and simple. They figured the rancher, Cade Holt, would just turn her right around and send her packing. They underestimated the stubbornness of a prairie wind, and the resilience of a woman's spirit. This was just the beginning, the first chapter in a story no one could have predicted. The wind whipped across the vast plains, a cold, unforgiving blade. It carried dust devils dancing on the horizon and the faint, distant sound of hooves, a whisper of life in a desolate landscape. Era, that's her name, tugged her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not her. Fate had a funny way of dealing out the cards, didn't it? See, her father had promised Cade Holt a bride. But he never specified which one. The rancher, a man of few words and even fewer smiles, was expecting Sienna, Era's younger sister. The pretty one. The one folks noticed, the one who turned heads. But when the wagon arrived, creaking and groaning under the weight of its unfortunate cargo, her father let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He shoved Era forward, practically throwing her into the wagon. "Take her," he'd barked. "She's the same blood, ain't she? What's the difference?" Era's stomach twisted into a knot of dread and humiliation. She wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what this was. Now is a great time to hit the like button, if you haven't already. And definitely consider subscribing so you don't miss another Western tale. This whole affair was a punishment, a cruel joke played on the daughter who, in their eyes, embarrassed them. A convenient way to rid themselves of a problem. Her hands trembled as she climbed into the wagon, the rough wooden planks digging into her palms. She tried not to think of the future. The rancher was waiting for her on the far side of those endless plains. A stranger, a man who had expected beauty and been promised a prize. The ride was silent, save for the rumble of the wheels and the mournful creak of the wagon. Every bump in the road reminded her, she was being delivered like unwanted livestock, a discarded piece in someone else's game. When they finally arrived, he was there. Tall as a tree, broad shoulders that could carry the weight of the world, a man who looked like he'd been carved right out of the land itself. Cade Holt, the rancher, the man holding her fate in the palm of his hand. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the wagon with a cold, assessing gaze. Then came confusion, followed by a hardening of his features when his eyes finally landed on her. "This," he said, his voice sharp and cutting as a winter wind, "is not the one I asked for. What do you think? Will the rancher keep the bride? Let us know your thoughts in the comments." Behind him, the ranch hands shifted uncomfortably, shuffling their feet in the dirt. No one dared speak. Era lowered her eyes, her cheeks burning with shame. She already knew what he saw, not the slim beauty he had been promised, not the prize her father had dangled, just a mistake, an inconvenience. She wanted to vanish into the dust beneath her feet, but she stood there, silent, rooted to the spot by humiliation and fear. Cade's jaw tightened, the muscles working in his cheek. He turned his head slightly, as if debating whether to send her straight back from whence she came. But her father's wagon was already disappearing over the horizon, leaving her stranded and vulnerable. The dust trailed off into the vast expanse of the horizon, a final, mocking reminder that there was no turning back. He exhaled, a long, weary sigh. "Fine," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You'll do for now." The words, carelessly spoken, cut like a blade, leaving a wound that would fester for a long time to come. "For now." He turned his back on her and walked toward the ranch house, his shoulders rigid. No hand offered, no word of welcome, just a command tossed over his shoulder like a discarded rope, "Come along. And don't fall behind." How about hitting the subscribe button while we get to the next chapter? She followed him, her feet heavy in the unforgiving dirt, each step taking her deeper into a life she hadn't chosen, a life she didn't want. The ranch house loomed ahead, a structure of strong wood beams and a porch weathered by countless storms. It looked more like a fortress than a home, a place built to withstand the harsh realities of the West. Inside, it was quiet, too quiet, a silence that amplified her fear and loneliness. Cade poured himself a drink, a shot of something strong and amber-colored. He didn't offer her one. Didn't even look at her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Your room's upstairs. End of the hall." He paused, his gaze fixed on the glass in his hand. "Don't touch what's not yours. Don't ask questions." He paused again, letting the silence speak volumes. "And don't expect anything." His voice trailed off, but the meaning was crystal clear. She wasn't wanted here. She was an obligation, a burden he was forced to bear. Era nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. No words came. She was afraid if she spoke, she might break, shatter into a million pieces. She climbed the stairs slowly, her thin shawl dragging against the rough wooden banister, each step a heavy weight on her heart. The room at the end of the hall was bare, functional, and utterly devoid of comfort. A narrow bed, a small, scarred dresser, nothing else. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs creaking under her weight. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Her father had thrown her away, discarded her like a broken toy. Her sister was free, still adored, still considered a prize. And this man, this stranger, looked at her like a problem, a mistake he'd been tricked into accepting. She pressed her hands together, whispering to herself, "Don't cry. Not here. Not in front of them." But the tears came anyway, silent and hot, trickling down her cheeks and into her lap. The wind rattled the window panes, a mournful symphony of loneliness. Downstairs, she could hear Cade's boots pacing across the floor, slow and heavy, like the steps of a man who didn't know what to do with what he'd been given. Now is a great time to hit the like button, if you haven't already. And definitely consider subscribing so you don't miss another Western tale. She lay down that night without supper, her stomach gnawing with hunger. The mattress sagged beneath her weight, offering little in the way of comfort. The darkness pressed close, suffocating and absolute. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a cruel refrain, asterisk, "She'll do, asterisk Cade." 2 sentences, 2 verdicts, 2 reminders that she was never chosen, only tolerated. But in that silence, something stirred inside her, a tiny spark of defiance, small but real. If this land was to be her prison, she would survive it. If this man expected her to break, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She clenched her jaw, whispering into the darkness, "They sent the wrong sister." A promise that fueled her soul, "They will regret what they did. Maybe one day someone will see me. Maybe somebody." Outside, the wind roared like an omen, a wild and untamed force that mirrored the storm raging within her. The ranch stretched endless and unforgiving under a merciless sky, a canvas of dust and hardship. Somewhere downstairs, Cade Holt sat in his chair, staring into his glass, knowing his life had just irrevocably changed, though he didn't yet understand the full extent of it. She thought the rancher might send her back the next morning, put her on the first wagon heading east. Instead, he gave her a shovel. The sun rose hard and bright over the plains, casting long shadows across the land. Now is a great time to hit the like button, if you haven't already. And definitely consider subscribing so you don't miss another Western tale. By the time Era came down the stairs, her stomach aching with hunger, Cade was already outside, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He didn't even glance at her when she stepped onto the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He just held out a shovel, the handle rough and worn. "You'll earn your place," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Breakfast is after work." Her stomach tightened, but she nodded, swallowing her pride. She wasn't here to complain. She wasn't wanted, but she would not be useless, a burden to be resented. The dirt was heavy beneath her bare feet, the weight of her new reality pressing down on her. The shovel bit into the hard-packed earth, the sharp edge cutting into her palms. Her arms ached within minutes, a burning sensation that spread through her shoulders and back. Cade worked beside her for a while, his movements silent, his presence a constant, judging weight. Every movement was strong, efficient, practiced, the movements of a man who knew the land, who was intimately familiar with its demands. He seemed to notice how clumsy she was, how unaccustomed to physical labor. By midday, sweat stung her eyes, blurring her vision. Her back screamed in protest, every muscle a tight, burning knot, but she didn't stop, didn't falter. Finally, he spoke, his words clipped and without inflection. "You're softer than your sister." A pause, a pregnant silence that hung heavy in the air. "Didn't expect you'd last an hour." She swallowed hard, forcing down the rising tide of humiliation. It wasn't a compliment, but he had noticed that she hadn't quit, that she was pushing herself beyond her limits. The days passed like that, a relentless cycle of work, silence, and more work. Meals were eaten across the long wooden table with barely a word exchanged. At night, she lay in the small upstairs room, her body exhausted, her hands blistered and raw. But something inside her whispered, "Endure, just endure. Prove them wrong." Cade watched her from a distance, his gaze always guarded, always assessing. When she stumbled, when she faltered, he fully expected her to give up, to collapse under the weight of the work and the loneliness. But she never did. Every morning, she rose again, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. One evening, the ranch hands returned from town, their voices low and conspiratorial. She heard them through the thin walls, their words like daggers to her heart. "They say the rancher was tricked," one of them whispered, his voice laced with amusement. "Supposed to get the pretty one, got the other instead. She won't last. They never do." Their laughter, cruel and mocking, cut through her like knives, leaving her raw and bleeding. She curled up on her bed, her fists clenched tight, tears burning in her eyes. But the next morning, she faced the shovel again, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet defiance, a steely resolve that surprised even herself. If they wanted her gone, she would stay. If they wanted her weak, she would grow stronger. Cade noticed. He didn't say it aloud, didn't offer any words of encouragement, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer, his gaze filled with a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. There was something in her he hadn't expected, a resilience, a grit that defied his expectations. Still, his voice stayed cold, his words clipped and dismissive. "You'll sleep under this roof," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You'll eat at this table." He paused, his gaze hardening. "But don't mistake this for anything else. This isn't a marriage." Her chest ached at the starkness of his words, but she nodded, swallowing her pain. She'd learned long ago not to expect tenderness, not to hope for kindness. And yet, she caught him watching her sometimes, his gaze following her movements when she tied back her hair with a piece of twine, when she carried buckets of water without being asked, when she laughed quietly to herself at a stubborn chicken refusing to go into the coop. The sound startled him, she could see it in his eyes. He hadn't realized she could laugh, that she possessed any capacity for joy. One afternoon, ominous clouds gathered on the horizon, swirling and darkening with unnatural speed. A storm rolled across the plains, dark and sharp, the air crackling with electricity. The cattle grew restless, their hooves pounding against the fences. Cade shouted orders to the men, his voice tight with urgency. The sky cracked with thunder, a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. Era stood on the porch, her heart racing with fear. She knew she was supposed to stay out of the way, to remain unseen and unheard. But when a gate broke under the force of the wind and a calve of young calves spilled into the open, she ran without thinking, her instincts overriding her fear. Her shawl whipped around her in the wind, blinding her. Her dress clung to her legs, impeding her movements. She stumbled in the mud, her arms outstretched, guiding the calves back toward the broken fence, her voice a faint whisper against the roar of the storm. Cade saw her. His eyes widened in surprise, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he would yell, would reprimand her for interfering. But he didn't. He just stared, his eyes searching her face as if he didn't know who she was anymore. The rain drenched her, plastering her hair to her face. Her hands were scratched and bleeding from the barbed wire. Her chest heaved with exertion, but the calves were safe, huddled together behind the repaired fence. The gate was closed. When she turned, Cade was there, standing closer to her than he'd ever been, his presence a wall of strength against the storm. Rain streamed down his jaw, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You could have been hurt," he said, his voice rough with a hint of concern. She met his gaze, her chin lifting in defiance. "For once," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I wasn't." It was the first time she'd spoken back to him, the first time she'd challenged his authority. The first time her voice hadn't trembled with fear. For a long moment, neither of them moved, their bodies close, the air thick with unspoken tension. The storm raged around them, but something else, quieter, sharper, shifted between them, a subtle but undeniable shift in the balance of power. The rancher thought she'd break. Instead, she tamed what he never could. Are you enjoying this story? Don't miss another. Please subscribe. The days at Blackstone Ridge settled into a familiar rhythm. Work before sunrise, work after sunset, a never-ending cycle of chores that seemed endless, backbreaking, and unforgiving. But Era never stopped, never complained. Her hands, once soft and delicate, now bore calluses, badges of honor earned through hard labor. Her skirts were always dusty, her face perpetually tanned. Her arms carried buckets, sacks, and tools until her body no longer felt like it belonged to her, but to the land itself. And Cade watched her from a distance, always silent, always guarded, his expression unreadable. At night, she mended his shirts by the fire, her fingers moving deftly over the worn fabric. The only sound was the crackle and pop of the burning wood and the low, contented breath of the old ranch dog at her feet. It wasn't companionship, not yet, but it was something, a small measure of connection in a vast and lonely world. One morning, before the sun had even cleared the horizon, Cade found her in the corral, standing perfectly still, her palm outstretched. A young stallion, a magnificent creature of muscle and fire, stamped and snorted before her, his eyes wild with fear and fury. It was a horse no one could handle, a rogue animal that had injured several experienced ranch hands. Cade himself had tried force, rope, sheer strength, but the animal fought back with a savage intensity, teeth bared, hooves striking with deadly accuracy. Now, Era stood before him with no rope, no whip, no weapon of any kind, just patience and a quiet determination. Her voice was low, steady, almost a whisper, a soothing balm against the animal's fear. "Easy now," she murmured. "No one's going to hurt you." Minutes passed, then longer, an eternity of silence and tension. The ranch hands snickered at first, exchanging glances of disbelief. She'd be trampled. She's mad. But Cade didn't move. His arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight, he watched with a growing sense of disbelief as the stallion's ears flicked forward, his muscles trembled, and then, slowly, tentatively, he lowered his head to her outstretched palm. The snickers faded into silence, replaced by a collective gasp of astonishment. Era stroked his nose, her touch feather-light, her voice a soothing melody. "No fight, no fear, just trust. Cade's throat tightened, an unfamiliar emotion constricting his chest. Something inside him shifted, unsettled, as he witnessed the impossible. All his strength had failed, all his years of experience had proven useless. But her quiet patience, her gentle understanding, had succeeded where he had failed. That night, he lingered by the corral long after the others had left, drawn to the sight of her brushing down the horse, her voice a soft murmur in the darkness. The animal leaned into her touch, finding solace in her calm for the first time. Then Cade thought, maybe she doesn't belong to the land. Maybe the land belongs to her. Maybe Era's touch can calm the beast within all of us. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The shift between them was small at first, barely noticeable, like the subtle change in the wind before a storm, but it was there, a palpable shift in the atmosphere between them. He began to show her things without words, with presence. Which fields to walk at dusk to witness the most spectacular sunsets, how to check a fence for weakness, how to spot the early signs of sickness in the cattle. It wasn't kindness exactly, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, a recognition of her worth, her presence. Era felt it, too, a subtle shift in the energy between them. The silence between them was no longer empty, no longer a wall separating them. It was heavy with something unnamed, something that vibrated beneath the surface. One evening, she found him standing on the porch, staring at the horizon, his face etched with weariness. She almost turned away, hesitant to intrude on his solitude. But then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Storm's coming." He paused, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "You'll want to bring the chickens in." Her lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile, the first genuine smile he had elicited from her. The first words he had offered that weren't commands, wasn't dismissive. She nodded, her heart lifting with a flicker of hope. "Yes, Cade." The storm came fierce, a raging torrent of wind and rain that seemed determined to tear the ranch apart. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape with brief, blinding flashes. Thunder rolled across the plains like the drums of war, shaking the very foundations of the house. Cade was out in it, battling the elements, securing the barn doors, fighting against the gale-force winds. Era pressed her hands to the windowpane, her heart pounding with fear. She watched him until she saw a flash of movement. A calf, separated from its mother, struggling in the mud, its cries lost in the roar of the storm. Her heart lurched with a sudden, overwhelming surge of protectiveness. Before she could think, she grabbed her shawl and ran out into the storm, her boots sinking into the mud, her clothes soaked to the bone within seconds. The rain stung her skin, the wind buffeting her body, but she didn't stop. She fell once, then again, but she picked herself up each time, her determination fueled by the desperate cries of the calf. The calf bawled, weak and terrified, its small body shivering with cold. She threw her shawl around its slick body, pulling it towards her with all her strength, trying to shield it from the wind and the rain. Then she felt another set of hands, strong and sure, joining hers. "Cade." Their fingers brushed against each other as they lifted the calf together, a jolt of heat running through her despite the icy rain. They staggered into the barn, breathless and dripping, their bodies trembling with cold and exhaustion. The lantern swayed overhead, casting long, dancing shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Era rubbed the calf vigorously, trying to restore warmth to its fragile body, whispering words of encouragement, her voice soft and soothing. Cade crouched beside her, his large hands gentle as he coaxed warmth back into the shivering creature. For a long time, neither of them spoke, their silence broken only by the roar of the storm outside and the sound of their own ragged breathing. When the calf finally quieted, its breathing slow and steady, Cade lifted his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time since she had arrived at Blackstone Ridge, there was no distance in his eyes, no judgment, no coldness, only raw, unguarded truth. His lips parted as if to speak, but he only exhaled, a long, heavy sigh that seemed to release all the tension he had been holding inside. Era's chest tightened, her heart pounding in her ears. What do you think will happen next? Share your prediction in the comments. The silence between them was alive now, charged with unspoken emotions. It was no longer a wall, but a fragile bridge, a tentative connection that spanned the distance between their two hearts. The days on the ranch grew longer, the work harder, but Era's hands toughened, her skirts tore, and her arms learned the weight of buckets and tools. At first, Cade kept his distance, maintaining the carefully constructed barriers that separated them. He worked the land, she worked the house, and they shared their meals in silence, a silence that had once been heavy and cold. But silence has a way of shifting, of evolving over time. What once was heavy, sharp, and cold slowly began to soften, to transform into something more nuanced, more complex. Cade found himself watching her when she didn't see, his gaze drawn to her without his permission. The way she carried firewood, even when her back ached. The way she rose before dawn, determined not to fall behind. The way her laughter, rare but real, would escape her lips, a melody that startled him with its unexpected beauty. When the barn cat tangled itself in her skirts, she didn't scream, didn't flinch. She simply untangled herself, her movements gentle and patient. She wasn't fragile like he had feared, not delicate, not useless like her father had claimed. She was steady, resilient, a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished, a force of nature as untamed and beautiful as the land itself. Then came the storm, the one that changed everything. The sky darkened without warning, the air thick with a strange, ominous energy. Wind ripped through the fields, tearing at the fences, scattering the cattle in a panicked stampede. Cade cursed under his breath, his heart pounding with alarm. He ran for the corral, his boots sinking into the mud. The storm was fierce, wild, merciless, a force to be reckoned with. Rain lashed down like knives, stinging his skin, blurring his vision. He turned and froze, his blood running cold. Era was out there, too, her skirts heavy with water, her hair plastered to her face, her body a small silhouette against the raging storm. She was struggling to close the heavy barn doors, fighting against the wind that threatened to tear them off their hinges. "Get inside!" Cade roared, his voice barely audible above the din. But she didn't listen, didn't retreat. She braced her body against the wood, shoving with all her might, her muscles straining with effort. For a heartbeat, Cade wanted to drag her away, to protect her from the storm, to force her back to the safety of the house. But then he saw her eyes, a spark of defiance burning bright within them. Not afraid, not defeated, but determined. Together, they forced the door shut, their bodies working in unison against the raging wind. Lightning split the sky above them, a blinding crack of white fire that illuminated their faces. The rain soaked them through, chilling them to the bone. But the barn held, secure against the storm. And in that moment, drenched, breathless, side by side, something shifted, something broke free. Cade looked at her, really looked at her, not as the sister he had been promised, not as the unwanted daughter cast aside, but as the woman who had stood her ground in the storm, the woman who had fought alongside him. Don't forget to hit that like button. We appreciate it. Later, as the thunder rolled away into the distance, leaving behind a fragile silence, Cade found her by the fire, her hands trembling as she wrung out her waterlogged skirt, her lips pale from the cold. He moved without thinking, his actions driven by a force he couldn't explain. He draped his coat over her shoulders, the warmth of the wool a small comfort against the chill. The gesture startled her, her eyes widening in surprise. But it wasn't the coat that made her heart race, that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the way his hands lingered on her shoulders, just a second too long, the subtle touch that spoke volumes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracked with emotion. Cade met her eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived at Blackstone Ridge, his gaze wasn't cold, wasn't distant, wasn't filled with judgment. It was searching, troubled, almost tender, a silent plea for understanding. But before either of them could speak, before they could explore the fragile connection that had formed between them, hoof beats thundered up the road, shattering the fragile peace. The door burst open, sending a gust of wind and rain into the room. And there she was, Sienna. Perfect, golden-haired, untouched by rain or hardship, wrapped in fine clothes, her smile bright and sharp, her eyes fixed on Cade. "Cade," she breathed, rushing forward, her arms outstretched, as if the storm had never happened, as if she had been the one meant for him all along. Era's heart plummeted like a stone, sinking into the depths of despair. Her sister, the one he had wanted, the one she had been traded for, the one who possessed everything that she lacked. Cade froze, caught between past and present, between the sister he had asked for and the wife fate had given him. Sienna's eyes flicked to Era, her lips curling in a disdainful smile. "Well," she said lightly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like father's joke went too far. But it doesn't matter. I'm here now." Her words cut deep, each syllable a sharp, painful blow. Era tried to steady her breath, to maintain her composure, but the fire in her chest threatened to consume her, to shatter her fragile control. Cade's jaw clenched, the muscles working in his cheek. His hand twitched as if he meant to reach for her, to offer her comfort, but he didn't, not yet. Sienna's voice dripped like honey, sweet and deceptive. "You never wanted her, Cade," she said, her gaze fixed on him, her voice dripping with confidence. "Not really. You wanted me. What will the rancher do? Will he send Era packing?" The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous, pregnant with unspoken truths. Era rose quietly, setting Cade's coat aside, her movements deliberate and graceful. Her heart thundered in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She wanted to scream, to fight, to demand to be seen, to be valued. But instead, she stepped into the shadows, retreating from the firelight, leaving them both in its warm embrace. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction. But inside, another storm had just begun, a conflict of emotions, of loyalties, of desires. Cade stood between two sisters, one the jewel he had once dreamed of, the other the woman who had stood in the storm beside him, the woman who had proven her strength, her resilience, her worth. His choice hung in the air, sharp as the lightning that still burned on the horizon, a decision that would determine not only his fate, but hers. And Era knew that whatever he spoke next would either break her, shattering the fragile hope that had begun to blossom in her heart, or finally set her free, allowing her to embrace the love and acceptance she had longed for her entire life. Sienna has returned, disrupting the fragile peace that she was starting to create. Cade must choose, and Era fears she will be discarded again, deemed unworthy, unloved. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Sienna's perfume clung to the air, a cloying scent that felt out of place, too sweet, too sharp for a ranch house, too artificial for the wild and untamed West. Her golden hair gleamed in the firelight, a halo of perfection that seemed to mock Era's dusty clothes and wind-chapped skin. She looked at Cade as if Era wasn't even in the room, her gaze possessive, demanding. As if the storm hadn't happened, as if Era hadn't stood by his side, fighting against the wind and the rain. "You never wanted her," Sienna repeated softly, her voice laced with a dangerous confidence. "You wanted me. You still do. Say it, Cade. Tell her the truth." Era stood frozen near the door, her body rigid, her muscles tense. Her throat burned with unshed tears, her chest tight with a crushing weight. Her hands clenched tight against her skirts, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. This was the moment she had feared since the wagon first stopped outside his ranch, the moment that would define the rest of her life, the moment that would either condemn her to a lifetime of loneliness or grant her the love and acceptance she so desperately craved. Cade's jaw flexed, his eyes flicking between the two sisters, his expression unreadable. Two sisters, two paths, two destinies intertwined by fate and desire. And if you're enjoying this tale of the West, be sure to like and subscribe. Era's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to beg, refused to plead for his affection. She would not grovel for love, would not demean herself by vying for his attention. She had lived a lifetime being mocked, dismissed, and unwanted. She would not bow down one more time. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out, each syllable clear and distinct. "If this is what you want, Cade," she said, her gaze meeting his, her eyes filled with a quiet dignity. "Then say it. Say it now, and I'll go. I won't live where I'm not chosen, where I'm merely tolerated." Her words stunned the room into silence. Even Sienna blinked, caught off guard by her unexpected defiance. Cade turned toward Era, and in that single glance, everything inside him broke open. A flood of memories washed over him, not of Sienna's beauty, but of Era's strength. The way she had held the barn doors against the storm, her body braced against the wind, her eyes filled with unwavering determination. The way she had carried buckets of water with trembling arms, refusing to quit, pushing herself beyond her limits. The quiet fire in her eyes when the world tried to shame her, the resilience that refused to be extinguished. She hadn't come to Blackstone Ridge by choice, but she had stayed by choice. And every day since, she had proven herself, had earned her place, had carved out a space for herself in his heart. Cade took a breath, deep and steady, his gaze unwavering. And when he spoke, his voice shook the room, the force of his emotions echoing in every syllable. "No, Sienna." He stepped closer to Era, his eyes locked on hers, his expression fierce and protective. "I never asked for her. But she's the one I want. She's the one I choose." Sienna's face twisted with fury. Her smile faltered, her carefully constructed charm cracking under the weight of his rejection. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came, her carefully crafted arguments dissolving into a bitter silence. Era's chest tightened, tears prickling her eyes, hot and disbelieving. Her lips parted, but she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. Cade closed the space between them, his presence filling her world. "Don't miss the conclusion. Please subscribe." His hand, rough and scarred from years of hard labor, lifted to her cheek, his touch gentle and reverent. He brushed away a tear that had escaped her eye, his gaze filled with tenderness. "You are not a mistake," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You are not a joke. You are mine if you'll have me." The world seemed to still, the fires crackling in the hearth, the distant thunder rumbling across the plains, the silence between heartbeats. All our exhaled a sob, half choked, half laughing, her emotions a tangled mess of disbelief, relief, and overwhelming joy. Her hands trembled as she reached for his, her fingers intertwining with his in a silent promise. For the first time in her life, she was not handed away, not discarded, not tolerated. She was chosen, wanted, loved. Sienna stormed toward the door, her face contorted with fury, her eyes sparking with venom. "You'll regret this, Cade Callahan," she spat, her voice dripping with scorn. "You're throwing away beauty for scraps. You're a fool." But Cade didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her existence. He kept his eyes fixed on Era, steady and sure, his hand clasped tightly in hers. And together, they listened as the door slammed shut behind her, its echo fading into the storm. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different now, no longer cold and heavy, no longer a barrier between them. It was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken understanding and a growing sense of peace. Cade cooped her face in his hands, tilting it toward him, his gaze searching her eyes. "You've carried so much shame, for far too long," he murmured, his voice filled with regret. "But I see you, Era. I see the woman you are, strong, steady, braver than anyone I've ever known." Her tears spilled freely now, but she didn't hide them, didn't try to stifle her emotions. For once, she let herself be seen, let herself be vulnerable, let herself be loved. And when Cade's lips finally brushed hers, soft, certain, reverent, she knew it wasn't pity, wasn't obligation. It was love, pure and unadulterated. The days that followed were different, filled with a joy she had never thought possible. The cabin no longer felt bare and unwelcoming, but warm and filled with laughter. Meals were shared, not endured, conversations flowed freely, and the silence between them was filled with a comfortable intimacy. Cade worked the land, and Era worked beside him, her presence a constant source of strength and inspiration. Not as a burden, not as an unwanted bride, but as his partner, his equal, his beloved wife. Neighbors who had once whispered cruel things behind their backs now looked on in surprise, their eyes filled with grudging admiration. For Cade Callahan, the giant rancher who was known for his gruffness and his solitary ways, had not chosen the beautiful sister, the one everyone expected him to want. He had chosen the one nobody wanted, the one who had been deemed unworthy, unlovable. And together, they were building something that no joke, no hardship, no storm could ever break. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, gold, and pink, Cade wrapped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. He pressed his forehead to hers, his gaze filled with love and gratitude. What began as a cruel trick, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. Era smiled through her tears, her heart overflowing with happiness. For the first time in her life, she believed it. She was no longer the daughter sent away in shame, no longer the shadow of her sister, no longer defined by her past. She was Cade Callahan's wife, chosen, cherished.